"Look under the table, sir." The trembling voice of Emma, the 3-year-old daughter of the housekeeper, froze Alessandro Moretti in the middle of his lavish engagement dinner at the estate. The little girl's eyes were wide with fear, her small hand gripping his sleeve as if trying to warn him of an approaching danger. At first, Alessandro thought Emma had merely seen something that frightened her, but when she kept pointing at the spot right beneath his feet, a fierce sense of unease rose in the heart of a man who had faced countless enemies without ever flinching. In just a few seconds, Alessandro would lift the tablecloth, and what lay hidden beneath would plunge the entire room into chaos. Stay with this story until the very end, because the mastermind behind this plot will be someone Alessandro could never possibly suspect. Alessandro leaned forward with the slow, unhurried grace of a man who had spent 2 decades learning that speed betrays fear. The candlelight caught the edge of his cufflinks. 70 of the most powerful figures in the New York underworld continued their laughter, their soft clinking of crystal, their measured conversations about shipping routes and offshore accounts dressed up in the language of legitimate business. The string quartet drifted through the opening bars of Debussy's Clair de Lune, a piece Alessandro had personally requested because Isabella loved it. No one noticed the small girl standing at his elbow. No one noticed the tiny fingers still clutching the sleeve of his jacket, or the stuffed lamb tucked beneath her arm, or the way her breath had gone shallow, the way children's breath goes when they know something the adults do not. His fingers found the edge of the ivory tablecloth embroidered with gold thread. He lifted it 2 centimeters. Just 2. Enough for his eyes and no one else's. And there it was. A small black metal box, no larger than a hardcover book, tucked precisely beneath the position where his knees had rested moments before. A red wire coiled along its side like a vein, and on its face, a small LED screen, glowing with a cold blue light, its numbers changing with obscene, mechanical patience. 02, 47, 02, 46, 02, 45. In that moment, time inside Alessandro Moretti's chest stopped. He had seen enough weapons in his lifetime to know exactly what he was looking at. Military-grade C4, professionally packed, the wiring clean, symmetrical, disciplined. A device built, not by an angry amateur with a grudge, but by someone trained, someone patient, someone who had done this many times before. The blast radius alone would gut half the dining room. Everyone within 12 meters would die instantly. Everyone within 20 would wish they had. The floor above would collapse. The garden entrance would seal in fire. 70 people. Isabella, Sophia, Emma. His eyes lifted from the counting numbers and found her. The 3-year-old girl looked back at him with those strange, serious, gray-blue eyes. She did not blink. She did not smile. Miss Lulu remained tucked under her arm like a small white sentinel. Her free hand was still gripping his sleeve as though the fabric of his jacket were the only thing keeping her from being carried away by whatever terror had brought her walking across a room of strangers on her own. She had seen, somehow, before anyone, she had seen. Alessandro lowered the tablecloth. Slowly, precisely, the gold thread settled back into place as though nothing had been disturbed, as though the ivory silk still hid nothing more sinister than crumbs and polished shoes. He straightened. His face did not change by a single millimeter. 2 decades in the underworld had taught him a lesson older than his father's grave. Panic kills faster than bullets. Panic in a room of 70 people, in a hall with only 3 exits, with a device counting down beneath the head of the table, would create the very carnage the bomb was built to deliver. A stampede toward the doors, bodies crushed against bodies, and the timer would not care. He inhaled once, steady, silent. He looked down at Emma, and something behind his eyes softened for exactly half a heartbeat before hardening again into the cold, precise instrument he had been trained since childhood to become. Then he began to move. He took a single step to his right. Just one. Casual, almost lazy, the way a host moves when he is about to greet a friend across the room. Marco Bellini stood 2 paces behind him, the way he always stood at events like these, close enough to protect, far enough to disappear. His eyes had already found Alessandro's face and read it. 36 years old, cheekbones sharpened by 2 tours in Kandahar, hands that had learned every language a man's body speaks before his mouth catches up. He knew every micro-expression Alessandro had ever worn, and he knew, before Alessandro even opened his mouth, that something in the room had gone wrong. Alessandro leaned in, the way a man leans in to share a joke. 3 words, barely a breath. Bomb. Evacuate. Now. Marco did not flinch. He did not glance at the table. He did not scan the room. He simply nodded once, as though Alessandro had just told him the wine service was running behind schedule, and he stepped forward toward the head of the long dining table. He raised his hand with the practiced grace of a man who had commanded platoons in the desert. His smile was warm, apologetic, perfectly calibrated. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying just far enough to reach the farthest guest, "forgive the interruption. We have a small technical issue with the gas line in the East Wing. Nothing serious, but for your comfort, we'd like to invite you to continue the evening in the garden while our staff resolves it. Champagne will be served outdoors, and dinner will resume shortly." There was a beat of silence, a polite murmur, and then 70 of the most powerful figures in the New York underworld rose from their chairs with the controlled reluctance of people accustomed to inconvenience. Napkins folded, chairs pushed back, diamond earrings caught the candlelight one last time. The string quartet, following an almost imperceptible gesture from Marco, transitioned into something quieter, something that would follow the guests out into the evening air. Isabella rose slowly, her hand still resting on the stem of her glass. She looked down the length of the table toward Alessandro, and her face was full of a question she did not yet have the shape of. He did not speak. He gave her the smallest possible nod. "Go, please, go." And something in her chest tightened, but she went. She followed the flow of ivory gowns and dark suits toward the garden doors, and she looked back only once. Sophia came running across the room with the panicked speed of a mother who thinks her child has disgraced her employer. She scooped Emma into her arms mid-stride, apologizing in 3 languages, her voice cracking on every syllable, completely unaware that the little girl pressed against her collarbone had just saved 70 lives with 5 whispered words. Alessandro reached out and touched Sophia's shoulder. "Gently, just once. She did nothing wrong," he said quietly. "Take her to the garden. Stay with her." He did not take his eyes off Emma until she disappeared through the doorway, one small hand still clutching Miss Lulu, the other resting against her mother's neck. Then the room was empty. Only Alessandro, Marco, and a black metal box beneath a tablecloth, still counting. 02:12. Alessandro had learned a long time ago that a mafia king does not survive by hoping. He survives by preparing for the worst thing that could ever happen, and then preparing for something worse than that. That was why, on the payroll of the Moretti estate, hidden inside a security team of 12 men, who looked like nothing more than well-dressed bodyguards in tailored black suits, there had always been one man whose real job no guest ever suspected. His name was Ricci, 41 years old, former combat engineer with the Italian army, 12 years diffusing improvised explosives in Iraq and Afghanistan. He had lost 2 fingers on his left hand to a roadside device outside Fallujah, and he had never once flinched at the memory of it. He attended every large event Alessandro hosted, standing quietly in hallways, sipping club soda, blending into the walls the way only professionals can blend. Tonight, Ricci had been standing exactly 20 meters from the dining room, in the eastern corridor near the kitchen entrance, watching the caterers move trays and thinking about nothing in particular. Marco lifted the small earpiece against his jaw and pressed the transmit key. His voice was flat, clipped, 3 words. "Dining room, now." Ricci was already moving before the transmission ended. 42 seconds, that was all it took. He passed through the corridor without appearing to hurry, the black canvas tool bag that lived permanently on a hook beside his post already slung over his shoulder. He did not ask a question. He did not change his expression. He entered the dining room, set the bag down on the thick Persian rug, unzipped it in one motion, and knelt beneath the tablecloth as though he had rehearsed this exact geometry 100 times in his sleep. The countdown glowed against his face. "Lingar, Senshi," Ricci murmured, so quietly that Marco had to lean forward to hear. "Military grade C4, auto timer built in, 3 parallel triggers, motion, thermal, manual. This isn't amateur work. This is a professional wetwork job. Whoever did this wanted to be sure." He did not look up. He did not need to. His hands were already moving with the calm, unhurried precision of a surgeon who had made peace with mortality long ago. 01:47. He selected a small pair of ceramic clippers from the roll of tools on the rug. He studied the wiring for exactly 4 seconds. He remembered a lesson taught to him by an old Israeli sapper in a bunker outside Ramallah. When the work is professional, they always invert the color code, never cut what they want you to cut. He passed the red wire. He chose the blue. He closed his eyes for 2 seconds, just 2, long enough to say something silent to whoever might be listening on the other side of a life he had made peace with a long time ago. He cut. The LED display jumped. 00:19. And then it went black. Ricci sat down heavily on the rug. His hands, which had held perfectly still for the last 90 seconds, began to tremble. "Clean," he said hoarsely. "It's dead, boss." Alessandro walked forward, knelt beside him, and placed one hand on his shoulder for exactly 2 seconds. Every man in the security detail knew what that gesture meant. "I owe you my life." Alessandro rose to his feet. He did not speak. He did not look back at Ricci or at Marco, or at the black metal box that no longer glowed. He simply straightened the lapels of his jacket, smoothed the cuffs of his shirt, and walked out of the dining room the way a host walks out to check on his guests. The garden had been transformed into something almost beautiful. String lights hung between the old olive trees his mother had planted decades ago. Waiters in white gloves moved through the crowd with silver trays of champagne. Someone had lit the outdoor braziers, and the smoke curled upward into the October sky in slow, unhurried spirals. 70 of the most dangerous men and women in New York stood on the flagstone, sipping Dom Perignon and complaining pleasantly about the inconvenience of gas lines, entirely unaware that they were still alive by the margin of 19 seconds. Alessandro's eyes moved across the crowd without appearing to search. He found her. Emma sat on her mother's lap on the low stone bench near the rose garden. Her feet did not reach the ground. Miss Lulu was pressed tightly against her chest, and her small face was still pale in the way children's faces go pale when they have seen something the adults around them have not yet learned to see. She was not crying. She had not cried at any point in the evening, but her eyes were still enormous, still open too wide, still fixed on the middle distance the way a child stares when she is trying very hard to be brave. Alessandro walked toward her, and what the 70 guests scattered across the garden would remember for the rest of their lives, what would be whispered in kitchens and back offices and quiet corners of the underworld for years to come, was this: the most feared Mafia boss in New York, in his hand-tailored black suit and his father's cufflinks, lowered himself to one knee on the cold flagstones in front of a 3-year-old girl. He placed one large hand very gently on her small shoulders. His voice, when it came, was rougher than any of his men had ever heard it. Rougher than the night his father died. Rougher than the day he took his first oath. "You saved my life tonight, little watcher," he said, "and you saved every single person standing in this garden." Emma studied his face with the grave attention of a small child performing an important task. Then she lifted Miss Lulu, ever so slightly, and held her out toward him. "She was scared too," Emma whispered, "but she said I had to tell you." Alessandro received the small stuffed lamb into his hands, the way a soldier receives a medal from a general. He held her for exactly 3 seconds. He looked into her worn cotton face, then he placed her back into Emma's arms, and closed the child's fingers around her with the same care he would have used to close a wound. Sophia broke. The tears she had been holding for an hour came silently, without sound. 5 paces away, Isabella pressed a hand against her chest, her lips parted, still trying to piece together what had just happened. But Marco had already understood. Somewhere among the 70 people drinking champagne in this garden, someone had tried to murder Alessandro Moretti tonight, and that someone was still here. Marco Bellini spoke into his earpiece 3 words at a time, the way a man gives orders in a battlefield where every syllable costs a second. "Lock the gates. No one leaves. Full search." The security detail responded with the silent efficiency of a machine that had rehearsed this. Within 90 seconds, the wrought iron gates at the front of the estate had swung shut. The service entrances were sealed. 2 guards took positions on the roof of the east wing. The garden, still shimmering with string lights and half-empty champagne flutes, quietly became a cage. The first murmurs of outrage came from the older capos. A senior man from the Genovese-adjacent faction demanded to know why he was being kept from his driver. A woman in an emerald gown, wife of a Manhattan attorney who laundered money for 3 families, snapped that she had a flight in the morning. Alessandro stepped out from beneath the olive trees and raised one hand. The garden went silent. "There has been an attempt on my life tonight," he said, his voice pitched exactly loud enough to reach the far end of the flagstones. "At this table, during this dinner, I ask for your cooperation while my men complete a search. Anyone who has nothing to hide will be home within the hour. Anyone who has something to hide will wish they had chosen a different evening to attend." No one spoke. No one moved. A champagne flute in someone's hand tilted very slowly, and a single drop fell onto the flagstone with a sound that felt too loud. Isabella stood near the rose bushes, one hand at her collarbone, listening to a story an elderly guest was telling her about a horse he had bought in Kentucky. She laughed politely at something she had not entirely heard. She had no idea what was happening. The search began. Handbags, briefcases, overcoats, silk shawls. The security team worked in pairs, one to open, one to observe, cataloging every item with the discipline of customs officers. Guests were asked to raise their arms. Purses were emptied onto silver trays. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was accusatory. Everything was thorough. 37 minutes passed. Dante Russo, 24 years old, only 3 months into his position on the Moretti security detail, approached Marco from across the garden with the walk of a man who did not want to arrive at his destination. His face had gone the color of old paper. In his gloved hand he held something small and dark and clearly wrong. "Sir," Dante said, and his voice cracked on the single word. "We found this, in the fiancé's handbag." He extended his palm. Resting on it was a small metallic device, no larger than a Zippo lighter, matte black, 2 switches on the side, a single red button on the top, protected by a plastic guard, a detonator, a remote trigger, of the kind that a professional would use to send a signal to a bomb that had already been placed. Marco did not move for a long moment. His eyes rose slowly from the object in Dante's hand and traveled across the garden until they found Isabella. She was 30 paces away, laughing softly at something the elderly guest had said, her head tilted to one side in that quiet, listening way she had. Marco pressed his earpiece. "Alessandro, come, now." Alessandro crossed the garden without hurrying. He took the device from Dante's palm. The metal was cold against his fingers. He turned it over once. He knew Isabella. He had memorized the shape of her sleeping face. He loved her more than he had loved anything since his mother's death. But the evidence was in his hand, and evidence does not lie, or evidence is not supposed to lie. Bruno Conti was summoned before the champagne had gone flat in the abandoned flutes on the garden tables. He arrived in the surveillance room 5 minutes later, still adjusting the collar of his shirt, as though he had been reading a book in his quarters instead of waiting somewhere just beyond earshot. He was 53 years old, a broad man with a shaved head and the slow, deliberate movements of someone who had spent a decade watching monitors and being paid handsomely to notice things. He had run the security systems of the Moretti estate for 10 years. He knew every camera angle, every blind spot, every hallway that did not appear on any recorded feed. He knew, in fact, more about the surveillance architecture of this house than any other man alive except Marco. He seated himself at the primary console, entered his access code, and pulled up the archived footage of the dining room. His fingers moved with unhurried professionalism. 6:12 this evening, Bruno said quietly. 48 minutes before service. The room was already fully dressed by 6. Only staff had access after that. He clicked play. The footage was crisp, color-balanced. The camera in the northeast corner of the dining room captured the entire length of the table at a slight downward angle. The candles were already lit. The chairs were pushed in. The ivory tablecloth with the gold thread lay smooth and undisturbed. At 6:12, the door on the left side of the frame opened. A woman entered alone. She was wearing the same ivory dress Isabella had worn to the party. Her hair was arranged in the same soft, low knot. Her walk had the same unhurried, quiet grace. She crossed the room, without looking at the camera, moved directly to the head of the table where Alessandro would later sit, and knelt down. For approximately 10 seconds she was hidden from the camera by the drape of the tablecloth. Then she rose, smoothed her dress with a small gesture Isabella had made 1,000 times, and walked out through the same door she had entered. No sound, only image. Alessandro watched it once, then again. Then a third time, slower, his face closer to the screen, his hands flat on the console. Bruno stood beside him with his arms crossed and his face arranged in the expression of a professional who deeply regretted what the footage revealed. It was a very good expression. It had been practiced. The door of the surveillance room opened softly. Lorenzo Moretti stepped inside. 58 years old, silver at the temples, wearing the same warm charcoal suit he had worn to the dinner. His face when he saw the frozen image on the screen was the exact face a loving uncle would wear. Shocked, grieved, unwilling to believe. He crossed the room and placed a warm, heavy hand on Alessandro's shoulder. "Nephew," he said, and his voice broke in exactly the right place. "I am so sorry, but we cannot pretend this does not exist." Isabella was brought in a moment later. She saw the image on the screen. Her face went the color of paper. Her lips parted, and no sound came for a full 4 seconds. "I never went there," she stammered. "I was in the guest suite with the stylist until almost 7. Ask her. Ask anyone. Alessandro, please. I have never in my life set foot in that dining room alone." But the camera had recorded her. And cameras do not lie. No one in the room had yet thought to ask that question. Alessandro did not speak. He simply lifted 2 fingers. 2 guards stepped forward from the doorway. Neither of them met Isabella's eyes. They took her gently, one at each elbow, the way one might guide an elderly relative down a set of unfamiliar stairs. Isabella did not resist. Her mouth was still open around the shape of a sentence she had not been allowed to finish. Her legs moved because they were being asked to move, not because she had told them to. She looked back once, at the doorway. Alessandro did not look up from the console. They led her up the wide marble staircase, along the second-floor gallery, past the family portraits her future father-in-law had commissioned before his death, and into the west sitting room. It was a small chamber, elegant and cold, furnished for guests who never quite arrived. A single armchair, a writing desk, a window overlooking the rose garden, an oak door, hand-carved, more than 100 years old, that locked cleanly from the outside. The lock turned. 2 guards took positions in the corridor. A third moved silently onto the flagstones below the balcony and stood there for the rest of the night without changing his posture. Downstairs, the 70 guests were allowed to leave. Each of them signed a 2-page confidentiality agreement drafted by the Moretti family attorneys, agreeing that nothing witnessed inside the estate that evening would ever be spoken of outside it. They signed without complaint. They understood the terms. The honor of the Moretti family required silence, and so did the integrity of whatever investigation was about to begin. Their cars carried them home into a night that had almost become a mass grave. Lorenzo stayed. He moved through the empty rooms of the estate, playing the role he had been rehearsing for 2 decades. He embraced Alessandro in the corridor outside the surveillance room. He told him, in the low voice of a man who had once tucked a small boy into bed after his father's funeral, that whatever needed to be done would be done together. He offered him grappa. He offered him silence. He offered him counsel. He said all of the things a loving uncle would say to a wounded nephew, and each sentence was perfectly weighted, and each pause was perfectly timed. And Alessandro nodded. He answered when he was expected to answer. He accepted the embrace. But he did not feel comforted. Something in the room was wrong. Something in the footage was wrong. Something in the way Bruno had crossed his arms. In the way Lorenzo's hand had landed on his shoulder at exactly the moment the frozen image filled the screen. He could not name it yet. He could only feel it, low and cold, in the place behind his ribs, where 2 decades of survival had taught him to trust the smallest whispers. At 2 a.m, Alessandro stood at the tall window of his private study, the curtains drawn back, and looked across the courtyard to the west wing. Only one light was still burning, a single warm rectangle against the darkness. The woman he was supposed to marry in 93 days sat behind that window like a prisoner in her own future. On the desk behind him, beneath the pooled yellow of the reading lamp, the small black remote lay silent, waiting to be believed. 3 a.m. came, and sleep did not. Alessandro left the study without a jacket, without a plan, without anything to say. He walked the long corridor of the second floor in his shirt sleeves, and the marble beneath his shoes was cold enough to feel through the leather. When he reached the west sitting room, the 2 guards straightened but said nothing. One of them looked at his face and then looked quickly away. The lock turned. Alessandro stepped inside once, only once. He did not intend to speak. He did not know what he intended to do. The room was dark. The single lamp that had been burning earlier had been turned off, or had gone out on its own. Only the moon came through the tall window, laying a rectangle of pale silver across the wooden floor. In the center of that silver rectangle, Isabella stood at the window with her back to him. She had not changed her clothes. The ivory dress she had worn to the engagement dinner still fell from her shoulders the way it had fallen when she had raised a glass of champagne to toast the man she loved. Her hair was still pinned in the same soft knot, though a few strands had come loose during the hours of standing very still. She did not turn around. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then her voice came, so quiet that it was almost not a voice at all. "Do you actually believe I did it?" Alessandro did not answer. He looked at her back. He looked at the fall of her hair over her shoulder. He looked at the delicate silver chain around her neck, the pendant her mother had given her when she was 14, the small oval he had watched her touch 100 times when she was nervous. The moonlight caught the silver and held it. She was so still she might have been carved. He should have crossed the room. He should have taken her in his arms. He should have said the words that were pressing against the inside of his teeth. He should have told her that a piece of him already knew, already understood, already refused to believe. Instead, the 2 decades of survival that had built him spoke first, and the voice that left his mouth surprised him with how cold it sounded. "I trust the evidence, not my heart. My heart has been wrong before." He paused. "The evidence hasn't." Silence. 30 seconds passed. She did not turn. She did not move. He could not see her face, and he was almost grateful for that. Then, slowly, She raised her hands to the back of her neck. She unfastened the clasp of the silver chain with the practiced movement of someone who had done it every night for 14 years. She lifted it away from her throat. She turned, finally, but only far enough to reach the small wooden table between them. She laid the necklace down. The pendant caught the moonlight once, and then it lay still. Then I don't deserve to wear something my mother gave me for love. Alessandro left the room. Outside in the corridor, he closed the door with careful, quiet hands. And then, for the first time in 20 years of a life built entirely on control, his hands began to shake, and he could not make them stop. The second day came, and then the third, and then the fourth. Alessandro did not eat. The staff brought trays to his study 3 times a day, and 3 times a day the trays were carried back to the kitchen untouched. He slept in 2-hour fragments, always in the leather armchair by the window, never in the bed on the other side of the room. He had not opened the bedroom door since the night of the party. The bed had been made for 2 people who were supposed to have shared it, and now one of them was locked in the west wing, and the other could not bring himself to lie down. Every morning, at precisely 7:15, Lorenzo Moretti arrived at the study door carrying 2 small cups of espresso on a silver tray. He would sit in the armchair across from Alessandro. He would place 1 cup within his nephew's reach. He would drink his own slowly, without hurry, the way a patient man drinks when he has all the time in the world. And then he would begin the same conversation he had begun the morning before, and the morning before that. "Nephew, you cannot let her live." The words changed order sometimes. The metaphors varied, but the melody underneath them was always the same. "Every day she breathes is a day the family looks weak. Every capo in this city is watching. The Genovese men are watching. The Brooklyn factions are watching. Even the old Sicilian branch back home is watching. If it becomes known that your own fiancée tried to put a bomb under your table and you spared her out of sentiment, the empire your father bled for will crumble in 6 months. Blood requires blood. That is the only language we speak. That is the only language they respect." He would let the silence sit. And then, on the 3rd morning, he added the sentence that would return to Alessandro at 3 in the morning for 4 consecutive nights, refusing to leave. Your father would never have hesitated. It was the truest thing Lorenzo had ever said in that room. Alessandro knew it. The old Don, his father, buried in Queens beside 2 brothers and a first wife, would have given the order before the guests' cars had cleared the front gate. He would not have visited the West Wing. He would not have looked at the woman's face. He would not have permitted the question to become a question at all. That was how his father had survived 31 years at the top of a mountain built of knives. And still, Alessandro could not do it. It was not love. Love had been frozen the moment the black remote landed in his palm. Whatever tenderness he had once felt was locked somewhere behind glass, waiting for a permission it had not yet been given. It was logic. Isabella had no motive, none. No debts to the wrong families, no hidden grudges, no cousin in a rival crew, no ex-lover in Vittorio's circle, no gambling losses, no dying relative who might have been bought. She worked in a small gallery in Brooklyn. She had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment above her father's bakery. People did not kill without a reason, and people did not kill so clumsily that they left the remote in their own handbag. 3 in the morning on the 4th night, Alessandro sent a single message to Marco Bellini's phone. 2 words. Study. Alone. Marco arrived in less than 4 minutes. He was still wearing the shirt he had worn during the day, the sleeves rolled to the elbows, the collar loose. He entered without knocking. He closed the door behind him and turned the lock. Only 1 lamp was burning in the study, the small brass one on the corner of the desk, throwing a low pool of yellow light across the papers and leaving the rest of the room in shadow. Alessandro sat behind the desk with his sleeves rolled and his tie gone, the whiskey on the sideboard untouched. He did not offer Marco a chair. Marco did not sit. Alessandro slid a small object across the polished wood. The remote. "Investigate everything again," he said. His voice was low and flat and did not tremble. "Every camera, every guest, every staff member. From the ground up, the florist, the caterers, the kitchen, the stylist, the men on the gate, every piece of footage from every camera in this house for the last 30 days. He paused. "Tell no one. Not Lorenzo. Especially not Lorenzo." Marco looked at his employer for 3 long seconds before he answered. In those 3 seconds, he did the arithmetic of an entire life spent in service to the Moretti family. He weighed the risk of the sentence he was about to speak against the risk of not speaking it. He decided. "Sir." His voice was quiet. "I've had questions since that night. I didn't dare say them." Alessandro raised his eyes to meet Marco's. "Say them now." Marco drew a slow breath. The device under the table was military-grade C4. That is not something a woman who works in a Brooklyn art gallery orders on the internet. Someone has to build it. Someone has to source the composition. Someone has to wire the triggers. Someone has to know how to invert the color code. That is a network. Isabella has no connection to any weapons dealer, any explosives specialist, any contact who could put her within 3 phone calls of that kind of hardware. I checked her communications in the first hour, quietly, without telling anyone. Her phone is boring. Her email is boring. She talks to her father about lasagna. He took another breath. And if she planted the device herself at 6:12, why did she sit at the table during dinner? The blast radius would have taken half the room. She would have died beside you. No professional builds a bomb, plants a bomb, and then sits inside the kill zone. That is not how someone commits murder. That is how someone gets murdered. Alessandro closed his eyes. He had been carrying those exact questions for 4 days, refusing to let them touch the surface of his mind, refusing to give them the dignity of language. Hearing them spoken aloud, in Marco's steady voice, in the quiet of the study at 3 a.m, was like watching a locked door open on its own. The heart knows before the mind admits it, and Alessandro Moretti, who had built an empire on doubt, was learning what it meant to doubt doubt itself. He opened his eyes. "Start with Bruno," he said. Marco moved without moving. By 4 a.m, he had already made 3 phone calls, each on a burner phone he kept for occasions that required his employer's name never to appear on any transcript. By 6, he was on the George Washington Bridge, driving east into New Jersey in an unmarked sedan, with a locked case on the passenger seat. Inside the case, wrapped in non-conductive foam, was the disarmed device Ricci had extracted from beneath the dining table on the night of the engagement. Dr. Elena Vasquez received him at a private laboratory in a converted warehouse outside Newark. 59 years old, 22 years with the FBI's Forensic Explosives Unit, before she had walked away from the bureau for reasons she never fully explained. She and Marco had known each other for 6 years. She trusted him more than she trusted her own former colleagues. She asked no questions about where the device had come from. She asked for 24 hours. She took 18. When Marco returned the next evening, Vasquez was waiting for him with 2 photographs, a schematic diagram, and a face he had never seen, wear an expression this grave. "The trigger mechanism is an auto-timer," she said, tapping the schematic with a pen. Self-contained. Once the countdown was armed and set, it would have detonated at the programmed second, regardless of any external signal. No remote could have started it. No remote could have stopped it. No remote could have accelerated it or delayed it by a single frame. She looked up at Marco. Whatever device you found in someone's handbag was decorative. It was jewelry. It had no electronic pairing to this bomb. Someone planted it to be found. Marco did not react outwardly. Inside his chest, something clicked into place with the finality of a lock finding its key. He drove back into Queens that same night. The second stop was a small third-floor studio above a Vietnamese noodle shop in Astoria, where a man named Denis Park sat behind 3 monitors and made deepfake footage for the kinds of clients who paid in cryptocurrency and asked no receipts. Denis owed Marco 2 lifetimes of favors for reasons that did not need to be explained. Marco handed him a memory card containing the 612 footage from the estate's dining room camera. Denis worked for 6 hours. "You want the polite version or the real one?" he said at last. "The real one." Denis turned one of his monitors so Marco could see. He zoomed in on the shoulder of the woman in the ivory dress as she crossed the dining room. He drew a small rectangle around a 2-inch section of fabric. He magnified it 400%. "See the seam here, along the edge of the shoulder? That's pixel interpolation. That's a generative fill smoothing over a boundary where 2 source images were composited. And here," he scrubbed the time code. "At 4.4 seconds, the frame index jumps by 0.4 seconds. Not a full drop, just enough to mask a splice." He looked up. "That woman in the video is not the woman who walked into the party that night. That is a face swap. Professional. Expensive. Somebody paid 7 figures for this work, minimum. And whoever built it had access to hours of high-resolution footage of her, plus direct access to your surveillance server to overwrite the original file. That is not an outside job. That is somebody inside your house." Marco stared at the frozen frame. Somebody inside the house. Somebody inside the house. Marco drove out of Astoria at 11:40 in the night, and by the time he crossed back onto the FDR drive, he had already made the decision. The audit trail on the surveillance server would have a fingerprint. The person who had overwritten the 612 footage had needed root access, and root access on that system belonged to exactly one man. The man who had stood beside Alessandro in the surveillance room, with his arms crossed and his face arranged into the polite regret of a professional who had rehearsed the expression. Bruno Conti. Marco did not go home. He slept in the car for 2 hours in a parking garage on East 61st, then drove out to Bruno's apartment in Bay Ridge as the first gray of the 5th morning began to lift the sky above the harbor. 5 in the morning. No warning. No knock scheduled. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a brownstone Bruno had bought 7 years ago with what he had always claimed was inheritance money from a Sicilian aunt. Marco climbed the stairs quietly. When he reached the landing, he saw it immediately. The door was ajar. Not open. Not closed. Ajar. By exactly 2 inches. The way a door is left when someone has stepped out for a moment and intends to come back. Marco drew his weapon and did not move for 80 seconds. He counted the seconds in his head the way he had been taught in Kandahar. He listened. He watched the strip of yellow light along the doorframe. He heard nothing. He pushed the door with the barrel of his pistol. The living room lamp was still on. Bruno Conti was hanging from the exposed ceiling beam at the center of the room. Marco stood in the doorway and read the scene the way a man reads a page he has been trained to read. 80 seconds became 120. He did not step inside until he had counted every inconsistency. There was no overturned chair. A man of Bruno's weight, roughly 230 pounds, does not step off nothing. If he had climbed onto a chair and kicked it away, that chair would be lying on its side within a 2-meter radius. The 4 dining chairs were in their 4 assigned positions around the small table. The angle of the rope did not match the drop. When a body of Bruno's mass falls even a short distance, the fibers of a rope stretch in a specific pattern, and the neck bends in a specific direction. This rope hung straight. This neck bent wrong. The bruising on Bruno's throat had 2 layers. One fresh, one older by perhaps an hour. The lower layer was the mark of hands. The upper layer was the mark of hemp. Bruno had been strangled first. He had been hoisted afterward. On the small mahogany writing desk near the window, 2 objects sat side by side. The first was a demitasse cup half full of espresso. The rim was still warm to the back of Marco's knuckle when he passed his hand near it without touching. The second was a Rolex Datejust with a black dial and a gold bezel. It lay face up beside the cup, its bracelet unfastened, positioned neatly, as though someone had removed it and set it down with care. Marco recognized the watch. Every capo in the Moretti organization knew that watch. Lorenzo gave them out every Christmas, engraved on the caseback, one to each of the men he considered personally loyal. Alessandro had never received one. Marco photographed everything. He left the way he had come. On the drive back into Manhattan, he pressed a single number. "We need to talk. Alone. Now. Come to the library." Marco had not been sitting on his hands. 2 days earlier, on the night Alessandro had first pressed the small black remote into his palm and told him to trust no one, Marco had done a thing he had never done before in 9 years of service to the Moretti family. He had walked into the underground garage at 3 in the morning, opened the passenger side wheel well of Lorenzo Moretti's dark blue Bentley, and placed a small directional microphone inside the housing. It was the size of a coat button. It transmitted to a secure receiver in the glove compartment of Marco's own car. He had not told Alessandro. He had not told anyone. If he was wrong, he would take the consequences alone. If he was right, he did not want the recording to exist inside anyone else's chain of custody. For 48 hours, the microphone captured 3 phone calls. The first 2 were conducted in a coded dialect Marco had never heard before. Some private argot of numbers and fragments of Sicilian that meant nothing to any translator he could reach on short notice. He set those aside. The third call, made from the back seat of the Bentley on the 2nd afternoon as Lorenzo was being driven back from a meeting in Little Italy, was different. Lorenzo had grown careless in the way tired men grow careless when they believe the finish line is close. In the middle of a sentence he broke discipline and said a name out loud. "Vittorio, we need to accelerate the plan. The nephew is asking questions." Marco had listened to that 7-word recording 11 times on the drive back from Bay Ridge. Vittorio De Luca, the boss of the De Luca family. The man whose organization had waged 20 years of quiet war against the Morettis over the East River waterfront. The man who, according to a story Alessandro had heard once from his mother in the last months of her life, and had never spoken aloud to anyone, had personally given the order that killed his father when Alessandro was 8 years old. The uncle who had taught the boy how to knot his tie for the funeral had been on the phone with the man who ordered the killing. Marco arrived at the estate at 8 in the morning. He climbed the west staircase and entered the library and closed the door. Alessandro was already there, waiting in the wing chair by the window, dressed in a black shirt with the sleeves rolled and no jacket. He did not stand. Marco laid the file on the low table between them. one document at a time. The photograph of Bruno's neck showing the double layer of bruising, the forensic diagram of the auto-timer, and the memorandum from Dr. Vasquez confirming that the remote had never been electronically paired to anything. The frame-by-frame deconstruction of the deepfake, with the pixel interpolation circled in red. The audio file of the recording from the Bentley, transcribed on a single page. And finally, a handwritten list of 6 names. Men inside the household, employees on the estate payroll, whose loyalty Marco had traced through service records, family connections, and Christmas gifts back to a single silver-haired figure at the head of the extended family table. Alessandro listened to Marco read every document aloud without interrupting once. When Marco stopped speaking, Alessandro lifted the glass of whiskey from the side table. He drank a single measured swallow. His hand did not tremble. Not one drop moved. The uncle who had taught him how to knot a tie, who had buried his father beside him when he was 8, whose lullabies had rocked him to sleep on the nights the boy had woken up crying, and underneath, a betrayal that had been growing quietly for 20 years, waiting patiently for the exact moment it would need to bloom. Alessandro stood. He walked out of the library without a word, crossed the second-floor gallery, and pushed open the door of the west sitting room. The room was empty. Lorenzo had felt it. For 48 hours he had watched his nephew across the breakfast table and known that something in the room had shifted beneath the floorboards. Alessandro's eyes had begun to slide past him instead of meeting him. The morning espressos in the study had grown shorter. On the 4th day, Alessandro had not appeared for breakfast at all. Marco Bellini had not been seen inside the estate for 2 days, which was longer than Marco had ever been absent in 9 years. The kitchen staff had noticed. Lorenzo had noticed. And Lorenzo, who had spent 20 years learning to read the smallest tremors in the surface of his nephew's face, understood that the countdown had reversed itself and was now running against him. He moved at 4 in the afternoon. Alessandro was in the library on the ground floor, on the north side of the house, 3 corridors and a staircase away from the west wing. Lorenzo had confirmed his location twice. He gathered 5 men in the small anteroom off the kitchen, men whose watches he had personally wound at 3 consecutive Christmases. Among them was Salvatore Greco, 39 years old, one of the 2 guards assigned to the door of the west sitting room since the night of the party. Salvatore was Lorenzo's man. He had always been Lorenzo's man. The 5 moved together along the servants' corridor and up the back staircase. At the top of the stairs, the second guard on the west door turned to greet Salvatore. He never finished the greeting. A pistol with a suppressor fitted to its threaded barrel coughed once, and the man dropped soundlessly against the wall. Salvatore caught him before he hit the floor and lowered him with the professional courtesy of a man closing a drawer. The lock turned. Isabella was asleep on the small daybed near the window, curled beneath a thin cashmere blanket she had asked for on the second morning and never returned. She was still wearing the ivory dress. She had not agreed to change into anything else. She had barely eaten in 4 days. A hand covered her mouth before she could sit up. Salvatore's other hand angled a small syringe against the side of her neck. The sedative was mild. She would sleep for perhaps 40 minutes, no more. Long enough, they carried her down the servants' corridor, through the pantry, down the narrow stone steps into the wine cellar. At the far end of the cellar, behind a rack of Barolos from the 80s, there was a low iron door that opened onto a passageway leading to the auxiliary parking court behind the eastern hedge. 3 people alive knew that passage existed. Alessandro was one. Lorenzo was another. The third had died of a heart attack in Sicily 11 years ago. A black Cadillac Escalade was already idling, headlights off, engine warm. She was gone before the sun touched the top of the west wall. 20 minutes later, Alessandro pushed open the door of the empty sitting room. His eyes moved once across the daybed, the abandoned blanket, the open window that had not been opened. His gaze settled on the small wooden table between the 2 chairs. The silver pendant still lay where Isabella had placed it 4 nights earlier. He picked it up. He closed his fingers around it. He tightened his hand. The edge of the pendant cut into the meat of his palm. He did not loosen his grip. A single drop of blood struck the pale silk of the rug and spread. 2 hours passed. Alessandro did not sit down. He stood at the window of his study with the pendant still closed inside his left hand. The fingers of his right hand pressed flat against the cold glass. Marco had already sealed the estate. Ricci had already been recalled. Every camera along the perimeter had been reviewed. The rear service gate was hanging open. Salvatore Greco was gone. 3 household staff were gone. Lorenzo was gone. Isabella was gone. And the passage beneath the wine cellar had been swept for footprints the professionals had been too careful to leave. At 6:47 in the evening, Alessandro's phone buzzed against the desk. Unknown number. Encrypted messaging application. He opened it. A video file loaded on the screen. The thumbnail was black. He touched it. Isabella was tied to a wooden chair in a room with unfinished concrete walls. Her wrists were bound behind the chair back with plastic zip ties. A strip of black cloth had been tied across her eyes. Her mouth was uncovered, and her lower lip trembled visibly as she tried to control her breathing. The ivory dress from the engagement dinner was still on her body, but the hem was streaked with dark soil, and the left sleeve had been torn at the shoulder. Someone had already hit her once across the face. A thin, dark line ran from the corner of her mouth to her jaw. A voice began to speak over the image. It had been processed through a digital filter that lowered the pitch and flattened the timbre, but Alessandro recognized it before the second syllable. 20 years of hearing that voice read him bedtime stories had made it impossible to disguise. You have 24 hours. Sign over the docks, the arsenals, the transport routes, every asset your father built. To me. Legally documented, executed through the family attorneys, notarized before sunset tomorrow, or she dies slowly, and I will make sure you watch every frame. Then an address. A commercial office building in Midtown Manhattan, the location where the transfer documents were to be delivered. The video ended. Alessandro watched it again. He watched it a third time. He was not watching Isabella. He had stopped looking at her face after the second viewing. He was watching everything else. The concrete wall behind the chair had a specific pattern of water staining, 3 parallel streaks from a leak in the ceiling above. The fluorescent light was mounted at an angle that suggested the fixture had been installed by someone in a hurry and never adjusted. The floor beneath the chair was a poured concrete slab of a type used in agricultural outbuildings, not commercial ones. And underneath all of it, at the very edge of the audio, so faint that Alessandro almost missed it on the first pass, was a sound that did not belong. A horse, distant, one long, low whicker, and then silence. A horse farm. He closed the video. He turned and looked at Marco, who was standing 3 paces behind him in the doorway of the study. And when Alessandro finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, and had been tempered by the last 2 hours, the way steel is tempered by fire and quenched 3 times before it holds an edge. Lorenzo miscalculated. He believes love makes me weaker. Love makes me more precise. He was not going to negotiate. He gave himself 3 hours. The capos began to arrive at 7 in the evening, summoned through channels that had not been used since the war of 1998. They came in dark cars and dark coats, 16 of them in total. Men who had sworn oaths to Alessandro's father, and had renewed those oaths to Alessandro on the day he took the seat at the head of the table. They gathered in the wine cellar because the wine cellar was the only room in the estate that Marco had personally swept for listening devices in the last 2 hours. Alessandro spoke for 14 minutes. He told them, without decoration, exactly what had been done. He named the deepfake. He named the auto-timer. He named Bruno Conti, and the way Bruno had died. He named Salvatore Greco. He named the passage beneath the cellar. He named the horse farm. He named Lorenzo Moretti. The room was silent when he finished. Some of these men had known Lorenzo for 30 years. 2 of them had been at the christening of Lorenzo's daughter. A third had wept at the funeral of Lorenzo's late wife. None of them spoke. None of them needed to. Alessandro looked into each face and read only what he needed to read. Then he named 4 men in the room and asked them to step to the far wall. They stepped. They did not resist. They understood. Marco led them out through the side door, with the quiet efficiency of a man clearing a table. They would be held in the sub-basement of the estate's east wing, under separate locks until the night was finished, at which point their questions would begin. Alessandro did not have time for them tonight. He turned to the 12 remaining capos. Every bridge out of the city, every tunnel, every private airstrip in Westchester, Nassau, and Bergen counties, the waterfront, the Hudson terminals, every corridor by which a black Cadillac Escalade could leave the state of New York in the next 6 hours. Sealed, watched, reported in real time. The room emptied within 20 minutes. While the capos moved, Marco worked. He had already begun pulling GPS pings from the network of tracking devices the Moretti organization maintained on every vehicle passing within a 1-mile radius of the estate. The system was not legal. It was extremely thorough. Within 37 minutes of the abduction being confirmed, Marco had traced a black Cadillac Escalade with tinted rear windows moving north along the I-87 corridor, exiting at Ardsley, and coming to rest on a 40-acre parcel of land in northern Westchester County. The property was registered to a limited liability company called Delta Bloodstock. Delta Bloodstock was owned by an entity called Meridian Turf Holdings. Meridian Turf Holdings was owned by a Cayman Islands trust whose beneficial owner, according to a document Marco should never have been able to access, was Vittorio De Luca, an old horse farm, 40 acres, one main house, 2 barns, a service road down to a creek at the back of the property. Alessandro summoned Ricci. The plan was assembled in less than an hour. 2 teams. Marco would take 15 men, approach from the west through the pine forest at the back of the property, and breach the lower level from the service road. Alessandro would take 20 men through the front gate. Head on, face to face. Uncle and nephew across the same room at last. Departure was set for 11 o'clock. The clocks in the estate began to count down. Midnight came, and the second day began. A thin rain drifted down out of a low black sky. The wind cut sideways through the pines, cold enough to burn against exposed skin. The horse farm sat in a shallow valley at the end of a private road, and from the ridge above it, the property looked like a black shape drawn in ink, disturbed only by 3 thin rectangles of yellow light in the windows of the main house, 2 on the ground floor and 1 on the second. 2 teams moved at the same time. Marco led his 15 through the pine woods along the western edge of the property, closing the last 200 meters on foot. The needles muffled their steps. The rain covered the small sounds a group of trained men still made when they moved together. Alessandro's team of 20 came down the front road in 3 vehicles, with their headlights killed, engines held to idle, coasting the last stretch on the natural downgrade, so that only the whisper of tires on wet gravel announced them. Both teams reached their assault positions within 4 seconds of one another, 12:03 in the morning. A perimeter patrol in a dark rain slicker rounded the corner of the western barn and saw a shape in the trees that should not have been there. He fired first, in panic, his shot going wide and burying itself in a pine trunk 2 feet from Marco's shoulder. Marco returned fire in a single controlled pair. The patrol dropped. The night, which had held itself so quiet for so many hours, tore open along its full length. Rifles opened up from the barns. Muzzle flashes stitched the darkness at 3 positions. Marco and 4 of his most trusted shooters moved fast. They breached the cellar door on the northeast side of the main house, took the stairs down 2 at a time, and cleared the basement corridor in 11 seconds. The last door opened into a bare concrete room. Isabella was there. She was still tied to the wooden chair. The black cloth was still across her eyes. Her lower lip was split and swelling where a man had struck her when she had tried to scream for the guards outside the door. Her breathing was ragged but steady. She was awake. She heard the door open, and she tried to speak, and no sound came. And Marco knelt beside her and said her name so that she would know before anything else in the room that she was safe. Above them, on the ground floor, Alessandro moved through the front hall with a Beretta 92 FS in his right hand, and Ricci 1 pace behind him carrying a short rifle. 3 of Vittorio's men rose from behind furniture in the foyer and tried to fire. They dropped in a span of 20 seconds. Alessandro stepped over them without looking down. Rain-soaked leaves stuck to the soles of his shoes. He crossed the marble floor, turned the brass handle of the double door to the main living room, and pushed it open. The room was warm. A fire was burning in the stone hearth. Vittorio De Luca rose from a cognac-colored leather sofa with a small Beretta already in his hand, and in the far corner, near the hearth, Lorenzo Moretti stood pale and still, the hands that had once carried a crying 8-year-old boy home from his father's funeral now lifting a pistol toward the nephew he had raised. Alessandro looked at his uncle across the length of the burning room. He did not raise his voice. He did not lift the Beretta any higher than it already was. He spoke a single sentence with the calm cadence of a man reading a line of poetry to himself before sleep. "You taught me how to pull a trigger. Thank you, uncle." 3 gunshots cracked the air almost as one. 2 seconds. That was all it took. Vittorio De Luca fired first, but his aim was 3 degrees off. Alessandro's round entered his chest above the sternum and dropped him back onto the leather sofa with the soft finality of a man sitting down after a long meeting. His weapon fell from his hand into the cushions. Lorenzo's shot missed entirely. Ricci's return round caught him in the meat of the left thigh. He staggered backward with a strangled sound and collapsed behind a heavy oak cabinet that had toppled sideways when Vittorio fell into it. He was still breathing. He was still holding a weapon. He was invisible from Alessandro's angle. 2 floors below, Marco was cutting the last plastic tie from Isabella's wrist. He said, "Stay here. Do not move. Do not follow." She did not hear him. She rose on legs that would not fully hold her. She pulled the strip of cloth from her eyes with a hand that was still shaking. She heard the second gunshot above her head and something inside her chest simply gave way. The man she loved was upstairs. That was all she understood. She ran. She ran barefoot across the cold concrete floor of the cellar corridor. Her feet found the narrow stone stairs, and she took them two at a time. She burst through the door onto the ground floor and followed the sound of Alessandro's voice into the main room, and she arrived at the doorway of the living room at the exact moment Lorenzo Moretti pushed himself up onto one elbow from behind the fallen cabinet and lifted his final pistol toward the back of the nephew he had raised. Isabella screamed. No sound came out of her throat. She threw herself forward. She struck Alessandro across the shoulders with the full weight of her running body and drove him sideways into the wall. Lorenzo's bullet, which would have entered the base of Alessandro's skull, entered her left shoulder instead. It tore through the muscle above her collarbone and exited into the plaster behind her. Blood sprayed the white wall in a wide, dark arc. She collapsed against Alessandro's chest. The ivory dress she had never had a chance to change out of, the dress she had chosen for the happiest night of her life, went dark and heavy in an instant. Alessandro caught her as she fell. He went down onto one knee with her still in his arms. Her face, pale and streaked with the dirt of a wooden chair, turned up to look at him, and her lips moved around a word she could not form. For one full second, the Mafia king inside him disappeared. There was only a man watching the woman he loved die in his arms. He handed her to Marco, who had come up the stairs 3 seconds behind her. He turned. Lorenzo was fumbling to reload. Alessandro did not give him a second chance. She had every reason to let him die, every reason to walk away and let justice take its course. And she chose to take a bullet for the man who had stopped believing her. That is what love does when love is real. Mount Sinai Hospital, 3 a.m. Isabella came out of surgery in a wheeled bed pushed by 2 silent nurses. The bullet had passed through the muscle above her left collarbone and missed the subclavian artery by exactly 2 millimeters. The surgeon who briefed Alessandro in the corridor said the word lucky 3 times, and then he said that he was not a man who believed in miracles, but that some patients survived in ways that could not be fully explained by anatomy. He said this while looking at his shoes. Alessandro sat down in the chair beside her bed and took her hand. He did not let go for the next 20 hours. Marco came in twice with water. He left it untouched. Sophia came in with Emma once, in the early morning, and Alessandro whispered that they should wait until she was awake. They waited in the corridor with the little girl asleep against her mother's shoulder. Miss Lulu still tucked beneath one small arm. Isabella opened her eyes at 11 the next evening. Alessandro did not deliver a beautiful apology. He did not decorate the moment with the words a man might rehearse in front of a mirror. He simply looked into her face and spoke the plainest sentence he had ever spoken in his life. I was wrong. Not for investigating. I had to investigate. Wrong for stopping to believe you, even for a single second. Her voice, when it came, was hoarse from the tube they had put down her throat. What broke me wasn't the evidence. It was the look in your eyes when you walked out of that room. He closed his eyes for one long breath. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and drew out the small silver pendant she had placed on the wooden table in the west sitting room. He leaned forward. He fastened the clasp behind her neck with hands he made himself keep steady. This belongs to you, he said. Nothing can change that. The door opened softly. Emma walked into the room ahead of her mother. She was still holding Miss Lulu. She climbed carefully onto the edge of the bed the way a small child climbs onto something she does not want to break, and she placed the little stuffed lamb into Isabella's uninjured hand. You can borrow her, she said gravely. Miss Lulu is very good at making people feel better. Isabella pulled the little girl into her right arm and pressed her face against her curls, and for the first time since she had opened her eyes, she wept. 3 months later, on a bright afternoon in early spring, the white rose garden at the back of the Moretti estate was set with 30 chairs. The wedding was small. Alessandro wore a white suit for the first time in his life. Isabella walked in on the arm of her father in a simple gown, the silver pendant resting at the hollow of her throat. Marco stood as best man. Sophia sat in the front row with her hands pressed to her mouth and her eyes shining. Emma walked ahead of the bride in a small pink dress, carrying the 2 rings on a velvet cushion with Miss Lulu tucked under her free arm, her small face as serious as a general presiding over the most important mission of her life. After the rings were exchanged, Alessandro lowered himself to one knee in front of the 3-year-old girl. He placed a small silver locket into her palm, engraved on the back with a single word, "Watcher." "You taught me how to listen," he said, "and I will remember that for the rest of my life." Dear friends, the people we least suspect are often the ones who see us most clearly. The smallest voices carry the largest truths, and the deadliest betrayals often wear the most familiar faces, the ones we grew up trusting without ever thinking to ask why. If Emma had stayed quiet in her small corner of the room that night, 70 people would have died, An innocent woman would have been executed by the man who was raised to love her, and an entire family would have been swallowed by an uncle's 20-year patience. She said 5 words. That was all it took. Has a child in your life ever told you a truth the adults around you were too afraid to say? Have you ever ignored a small voice and later realized it was the only voice in the room telling you the truth? Please share your story in the comments. Every message is read, and every reflection matters here. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button and share this video with someone you love, especially someone who needs to be reminded that trust is the most fragile and most precious thing a person can offer. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another human story like this one. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. Wishing every one of you good health, gentle days, and peace in your homes. See you in the next video.